Welcome everyone to our, what is this, our third strategic planning process? Our third strategic planning process. And I'm just going to turn it over to our city manager.
Thank you, Mayor and Commissioners, for taking time out again today to very deliberately discuss the development of our strategic plan. And we have a very full agenda today. Matter of fact, we come into today's session knowing that there's a possibility we're going to try to get through many of the items, but there's a possibility that we will complete the majority of it because we're going to go a little bit deeper on the plan itself. This is our best work to date. You should have received a draft copy of it via email last week, and where we not only talked about the lofty aspirational things around vision and mission, but we got into the specific outcome areas as with both objectives, and we began to unveil some of the metrics. And so we're going to be a little bit deeper today. And I think what you will see is that there's a lot of things in the plan, and I have not, beyond the 6 priority areas, have not enumerated all of them, but I think between the various objectives and metrics, there are hundreds of them. And so those are the things we certainly want to do. That is the what of what we should be doing, and that's what we want you to help us today in describing everything as a city we should be doing, the what. But after today, once we get on the plan, we are not going to be able to do everything in that plan. And so the reason why I say it may take another meeting is because we want to talk about when we're going to do it. And so what are some of the things we're going to do in short term, near term, and long term, and be very deliberate about that, and attach the appropriate metrics and assignments and accountability to make sure we know it's going to get done. And just because there are a lot of things that we should be doing, and when we prioritize the things that we can do, it doesn't mean we're saying no to the other areas. It just means that we're saying not now. We will get to it, and we're going to plan when that might happen. We're happy to have Scott Patton again with us today. Is it just me, or is it continues the
Sounds a little echoey.
Yeah. We're happy to have Scott Patton today from Plant Moran with us, and he's managing consultant, and we have a lot of staff here who you will hear from today, the various staff that's been working on outcome teams that will be taking us through their work that they've been very diligent on. I want to thank them for the work. I also want to thank Allison Sutter, our sustainability program director. But she's also been wearing another hat in terms of being our strategic internal consultant on planning. And I want to thank her for the work, along with all of the management team that you see again that's flanked to my right over there, as well as the other partners from all across the city who are in the room, and you'll be hearing from some of them in terms of our staff. And so we really, really appreciate the work. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Allison, who will begin taking us through some of the material.
Okay. Well, thank you, City Manager. I hope that my speaker is turned on, and welcome back today. Very excited to continue the conversation.
Let me correct myself again. I'm going to turn it over again to Ms. Sutter, who will take us through some of the materials. We have a just to let you on the inside, we have had conversation among our cabinet meeting to make sure that we show each other the proper respect in public. That if we expect both to give respect to citizens, we also should show ourselves respect and take ourselves as seriously professionally. So with that, Ms. Sutter.
Thank you, City Manager Washington. I appreciate it. And hello, commissioners and the staff that is here with us today. Very excited to be continuing our conversation from the end of January on strategic planning. And as the City Manager indicated, we have a pretty robust update that we're going to walk through today. And so I'm going to keep kind of the introductory part fairly short and then really want to get into the content of the plan. So very high level for purposes of today. I'm going to provide a little bit of framing again for our conversation, review the work that's been done since January until today, and then we're actually going to have some of our project team members come up here to help provide a little bit more of an in-depth review of the different strategic priorities that they've been helping to lead. And so they can review that, and then you can ask for questions on clarifications, or if you have other questions or comments that you want to make per strategic priority, that's kind of how we'll flow for the purpose of today. And as City Manager Washington indicated, we anticipate that we may not get through the full content today of the plan, and so we have reserved on March 5th, the special briefing timeframe in case we need a little extra time beyond today to continue the conversation. I do want to make a note for those who may be watching live stream or participating at home that we do have the draft preliminary strategic plan available on our website. So you can go to the website and to our strategic plan update website, and there is a link with the draft preliminary strategic plan that you can follow along as well if you would like as we're going through today. And as we've done in the past, our live stream will be posted as well as the slides from today as well. So with that, I'm going to jump into, hope this framework is becoming one of your new best friends. I refer to it often. I think it's really important to ensure that we're all approaching this with the same mindset, using the same terms and the same understanding as we work through the strategic plan. So high level, just want to point out again in the top left, last time we talked about how the strategic plan aligns with our master plan, being that overarching 20 to 30 year community plan. And then, of course, having our annual fiscal plan, and the strategic plan right now is drafted as a 4-year plan from fiscal year 20 to fiscal year 23, and that will drive our fiscal plan as we move forward into the future, and then help on more of a short-term basis ensure that we are aligning with what is in the master plan. So I won't go in depth, but we talked about leading with values, and that being something that really sets the framework for all of the work that we're doing. These should be long-term, and this is really, what it is that we stand for as staff and as elected officials in terms of the work that we're doing in leading with values and the work that we do. Vision is really that aspirational statement of where it is that we want to go. The mission, what is it that's descriptive of what the work is that we do on a day-to-day basis. Our strategic priorities and outcomes, the priorities, sometimes we refer to those as buckets. That's how we kind of categorize the work throughout the strategic plan that we'll be focused on. And the outcome statement is, what are we trying to achieve in each of those different priority areas? So I kind of refer to it as a little mini vision statement specific to that strategic priority. And then, of course, once we get into the bulk of the plan, that's objectives, looking at, where are we going to focus our efforts, strategies, how are we going to do it, and metrics are how we track it. I know it does seem like a number of layers, but we'll work through that today, and if you have any questions or would like any clarification, please don't hesitate to ask. So the red circles that you see now, that's really where we focused on January 22nd for the purposes of the conversation we had for our strategic planning session. We talked a lot about the values as well as the vision, got some great feedback on the vision statement, shared with you the strategic priorities and those outcome statements. We got a little into the strategies and what work had been done. But for purposes of today, this is where we'll focus. And I'm very excited because we now have a full draft preliminary strategic plan that includes all of the components so that you can see them in their entirety and provide some feedback with kind of the holistic approach to the plan. And so there are a few items that are very new that we'll review with you today, such as the mission statement and really the metrics that are included in the strategic plan in terms of sharing those with you for the first time. Okay. So values, as I said, starting with values. And I do want to reiterate these values and what the descriptions are that we have included for the values. And so I am going to read them because I think it's important to ensure that we're all keeping these top of mind as we work through the strategic plan. But accountability, always acting with integrity and transparency and being responsible for what you do and say. The second one, collaboration, working together in partnership with others, and teamwork. customer service, professionally taking care of those that live, work, and visit the city, providing respectful, excellent, high-quality service and assistance before, during, and after the person's interaction with the city. So equity, there was a good discussion around equity at our last session. So this is actually a completely new description that was created by our equity champion team. And the revised description states, leveraging city influence to intentionally remove and prevent barriers created by systemic and institutional justice. Institutional injustice, I'll make that correction. Innovation, challenging how things have been done before, fulfilling customer needs by offering new ways of making lives better and operations more successful, being nimble, self-aware, and open to feedback. And that last part, again, was some good feedback that we got from the last commission session that was added to the description for innovation. And I do really appreciate that when I was having a conversation with the city manager, he said innovation is not imitation. Imitation is implementing best practices, right? Innovation is truly creating something new and being innovative. So I reflect on that often when I'm trying to think, is this innovation? And then sustainability, the ability to be maintained and making decisions with an understanding of how those decisions impact people, the community, and the planet, in addition to our finances. So now I just want to pause and see if you have any reflections or thoughts that you would like to share on some of the revisions or the descriptions for the value statements. Yes, Commissioner Moody.
On innovation, why did you use the word being nimble?
Being nimble? I think we've had conversations with staff, and I know the city manager can jump in, but being nimble is being willing to make a change at the time when a change is needed, and knowing that we want to allow for kind of that nimbleness. I don't know if there's anything you want to expand on.
Yeah, you could have used a lot of other words, agile or being responsive, but just having the flexibility to pivot whenever it's needed, make adjustments.
I just want to say how much I appreciate the distinction that you made around innovation. That's something to really keep in mind. Thank you, City Manager. Mark?
Are we feeling good with these? Okay, good. I know the staff's been working on them hard, so I just want to make sure that if there were any other comments, I think we're all excited to be at a place where we can call them fairly final at this point. So appreciate your feedback and your guidance and thoughts on our values. So then moving along to the next area is the vision statement. And again, this being something that is set by City Commission in terms of what is it that we aspire to be, pushing us to be a little uncomfortable thinking about, is this something that we can achieve, and where is it that we're heading? And so there was a lot of great conversation again about the vision statement during our last session. So staff went back and we had a lot of conversations about some of the suggested revisions that you suggested, and the current working draft that we have for the vision statement is Grand Rapids will be nationally recognized as an equitable, welcoming, innovative, and collaborative city with a robust economy, safe and healthy community, and the opportunity for a high quality of life for all. So I again welcome your thoughts and feedback on the revised vision statement.
I'll add that I think it captures a lot of the conversation we had around this table last time, and I think we need to be very clear that this is our vision and we need to stand firmly behind it. So thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Bliss.
So you said it aloud last night for the first time in front of the city. How did it feel to speak it out into the room?
It felt good, and I think now, in light of everything, once you say this is what people will expect, and they know when it is, and they know when it's not, when it's just words. And so now we hold ourselves up to a different standard, affirm this. Which you hadn't voted on it yet, but
Right.
just beginning to share it, yeah.
Any other comments? Take your silent acquiescence as that you are fully in favor. Yes, Commissioner Lanier.
So I think it does capture a lot of the conversation from last time, and maybe in some ways too much, because it feels a bit wordy and choppy for me personally. I read it when we received it electronically, and I just kept reading it. I was having a challenging time having it flow, which may make it a challenge to remember, which I think is important. And it could just be me, so if anybody else wants to weigh in on that. I think the commas will tell you just how many words there are. 12 commas in here.
Yeah, you know, I guess I don't necessarily see it as choppy. I hear what you're saying. It's a little long. I do think it does capture a lot of what we talked about, and it's really bold, and sometimes you need a few more words to do that. I think if we move forward with this vision, then the challenge is going to be, how do we make sure that this is front and center all the time? And I think there's ways we can do that. I mean, when I was at Dave Lodge at St. John's, we had our vision. Every single one of us had it in our office, right in front of us, every single day. And so I think we can have that conversation after we get through the process. But I think it's a good point. How do we make sure people know it, believe it, hold on to it, and have it guide their behavior?
And then do we want to put a timeline on when we will become this? To really make it challenging.
Yeah, that's a good question.
I think it is ontological. We see it, and we are becoming it every day. It's aspiration we want to be, but it's in our being every day.
Sounds like preacher words.
It's philosophical. It's philosophical.
Okay, so to Commissioner Lanier's concern, I think we can make a couple slight edits. This is my teacher writing hat here. Okay, it's simple. It's simple. Just listen. Grand Rapids will become a nationally recognized as an equitable, welcoming, innovative, and collaborative. Or as, get rid of the and. Get rid of the and. Because city's already implied, because it's Grand Rapids, with a robust, safe, and healthy community with, instead of and the, opportunity for a high quality of life for all. So you can get rid of and, city, and the. And I think it flows better.
Say that again.
Right.
Oh, like I did
Our
that
English
well.
teacher among us.
Yeah. Grand Rapids will be nationally recognized as an equitable, welcoming, innovative, collaborative city. As equitable, welcoming, innovative, and collaborative with a robust economy, safe and healthy community with opportunity for a high quality of life for all. So you're just getting rid of
So you're getting rid of four words.
And it does just,
I'm sorry.
those we call junk words when you're editing, that you just get rid of them if you don't need them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so Grand Rapids will be nationally recognized as an equitable, welcoming, innovative, and collaborative with a robust economy, safe and healthy community with the opportunity for high quality of life for all. Yep, I like it.
All right. Good feedback. Thank you. Okay. Let's move on to the mission statement, which is something that we're sharing for the first time with the group. And so I know that City Manager Washington has worked on this in collaboration with his staff to come up with this. And as what you were saying, we worked very hard to make this concise and memorable and to the point. And so the mission statement reads, to elevate quality of life through excellent city services. Okay, moving on, I like it. All right, well those are kind of the big high-level overarching components for our strategic plan. We're going to shift gears now a little bit to get more into the actual content, and that starts with revisiting the strategic priorities that we had good conversation about in January. So there have only been some small changes to the actual text of the strategic priorities, and then of course the addition of equity as the seventh. So I just want to review here the strategic priorities as they are listed on the slide as governmental excellence, economic prosperity and affordability, mobility, safe community, health and environment, engaged and connected community, and equity. And so based on our conversation in January, there was a lot of discussion about equity and requests to have that be shown as a seventh strategic priority. And so staff, we heard you and worked very diligently on this, had some really in-depth conversation that were fantastic with a diverse group of team members from the executive team and cabinet to some equity champions that were identified after our last strategic planning session, and we're looking forward to discussing with you how we have gone about trying to embed that and work with equity throughout the plan, and then can get some feedback from you as well as we discuss that. So I know this slide is text heavy, but in the plan currently as it exists in draft format, there isn't anywhere where all of the outcome statements are shown together, and I thought this was important because, as I said, to me I look at the outcome statements as kind of a little mini vision specific to that particular area, and so I think it's important to bring those together. And so actually after this I only have one slide, and then I will be done in inviting some project team members to come up here to speak about the different work that's been done for each strategic priority. But if you'd bear with me, I think it's important, particularly for those listening in, that we review these and hear these in context together. So for governmental excellence, talking about a fiscally resilient government powered by high-performing and knowledgeable staff, equipped with the appropriate tools and resources to offer excellent, equitable, and innovative public service. So economic prosperity and affordability. Residents, employees, and businesses have pathways to financial growth and security. Mobility. Innovative, efficient, and equitable mobility solutions are safe, affordable, and convenient to the community. Health and environment, safe community. All people feel safe and are safe at all times throughout our community. Health and environment. The health of all people and the environment are advocated for, protected, and enhanced. Engaged and connected community. Residents and stakeholders have awareness of and voice in decisions that affect them and receive culturally responsive and proactive communication. And then equity, advance equitable outcomes and opportunity by leading with racial equity to eliminate disparities. So the teams are going to come up and we'll kind of present those again where you can have some dialogue, and they'll go into a little bit more detail for each of the strategic priority areas. So right now I just want to frame how the remainder of our time will work, and I will be mindful of the time and will work in a break at the best time that we transition perhaps from one priority to another. Knowing that this is a bit of a time, almost 3 hours. We did schedule until 4:15 to be here today. So I just wanted to frame up a couple of items with respect to how the remainder of our time will flow, and specific to the content in the plan. So I do want to acknowledge there are still some gaps in the plan. And if you've read it, you've probably seen that. Staff are still working really hard on identifying some metrics, collecting some data. I know there are probably some, hopefully not too many, but some grammatical errors and things that we're working through as well. With respect to the objectives, there was only one new objective that was created, and that was in direct response to your feedback, and that was in the economic prosperity and affordability section with an objective that's been created around making Grand Rapids a destination city and talking about tourism. And that was, again, a recommendation that came out. So that's the only new objective that's been added to the strategic plan. And so with respect to the strategies and the metrics, the way that I've continued to speak to our team about this and would like to frame, in the plan you'll even see that it lists the strategies first and then it lists the metrics. And they are disaggregated. There's not a one-for-one. There's not here's a strategy, here's a metric, here's a strategy, here's a metric. Because the strategies, again, are really trying to talk about what is it that we can do? What programs can we implement? How can we leverage influence to achieve the objective? And the metrics are supposed to be measuring how well are we doing? How well is the health of the community? Right? And so it may be a different metric to help identify, even though there might be a strategy or two trying to move the needle, and we have one objective to try to help track our progress toward achieving that metric. So I just wanted to clarify that you won't always see a one-to-one necessarily between the strategies and the metrics. And then I wanted to take a minute to acknowledge that there are some overlapping concepts. And maybe you read and you thought, okay, this is here, but it could also fit in this other section, and how does it tie? And to us, that's good, right? There should be things that are overlapping, because the strategic plan is meant to be cross-disciplinary, and we need to be working together in different areas. It's not something that's just owned by one department and can be housed by that one department. To truly be collaborative, it needs to be pulling on the expertise and the talents of different departments throughout the city. And so there are overlapping concepts. So I wanted to highlight a few for you, just so you have in the back of your mind, if you're thinking as we're going through things, oh, where's that? It may, you may remember that we kind of identified it. And they're important concepts that are housed in one place, but are intended to affect all city work and everything throughout the strategic plan. So some of the examples. In governmental excellence, we have a strategy around embedding equity throughout governmental operations and disaggregating all data by race, ethnicity, geography, and gender. Right? So any metric you see throughout this plan, we intentionally aren't calling out and saying disaggregated by race and ethnicity, because it's stated and it's something that will be incorporated in every metric throughout the plan. Similarly, in governmental excellence, we talk a lot about staff and about training and about hiring and staff capacity, our facilities and our technology. So there may be a specific technology for mobility, but we're housing technology under governmental excellence in terms of looking at technology holistically across all of our departments and all of our work. Micro, local business enterprise contracts and programs are in our economic prosperity area, so that's where that's housed. River restoration, that's in economic prosperity. Of course, it aligns a lot with health and environment as well, but right now we've said this fits most appropriately in our view from economic prosperity. The Census 2020. Participation, right? That's really big in a very broad area that impacts a number of different items throughout the plan. That's housed in the engaged and connected community, as is surveying community members and getting feedback, right? That's in that area, but you'll see there are even some blanks where the team has identified we want to be able to measure, right, how people feel about safety. Well, the way we'll do that is through surveying. Right? So just know that there are some items that talk about kind of how are we collecting information and how are we doing and how are we surveying our community, and that's housed in engaged and connected community. And just a couple others, transportation safety issues. So Vision Zero, or work around keeping those who are biking or pedestrians safe. Right? First and foremost, it's safety. So we've housed that in safe community. So as you go through mobility, just keep that in the back of your mind. If really first and foremost, the highest priority is safety, we have stated and think from a staff's perspective that we believe that it belongs in safe community. And then lastly, homelessness and kind of around home repair services. These again could fit in a number of the different strategic priorities, but looking at a hierarchy needs of needing safe shelter being first, that is housed in the safe community as well. So I think the metrics, we've also worked really hard for these to be outcome-based metrics, right? We don't want to measure widgets. It's not how many of X did we have. We want to have a metric where it's measuring how are we performing to achieve kind of this objective and the outcomes that we have. So we're trying to kind of stay at a higher level with respect to the metrics. So with that, as I said, we're going to start, and we don't exactly align with the organization of the priorities in the strategic plan. There are a couple where we're going to go out of order for purposes of our conversation today, but we'll note that and help orient you to the right page of the strategic plan. But I am going to ask the project team members who were leading discussions around each of these priorities to come up and provide an overview of the plan, talk about kind of some of the significant changes or new additions from the time that you saw it before. One person's going to primarily lead that overview, but the other team members are going to be able to be here and available for questions that you may have. And so before I turn that over, I just want to take a moment. I know City Manager Washington did it, but I really want to acknowledge all of the strategy team members that are in the audience today. And so I know it's the majority of you that's in here, but I think it's important if you were on the executive strategy team and outcome team, or if you were support staff that were helping in this process, I would like you all to stand up so that we can acknowledge you and really show that this has been a huge team effort on behalf of a lot. So outcome team members, come on. David, stand up. Laura, stand up. John. Yes, so thank you. Yes. It has been a huge, huge undertaking, and a lot of staff have dedicated their time and their knowledge and their expertise to developing the content of the plan. So with that, we're going to start with governmental excellence. And so I'm actually going to tee this up. We don't have any additional slides outside of just kind of a change, so we know the different strategic priorities that we're going to go to. But I'm now going to invite Luke Canfield and Stacy Stout and Brandon Davis to come up here to present and review governmental excellence. And those should be turned on.
Brandon, do you want to kick us off?
Sure.
All right.
Good afternoon. Under governmental excellence, our outcome is a fiscally resilient government powered by high-performing and knowledgeable staff, equipped with the appropriate tools and resources to offer excellent, equitable, and innovative public service. And the first objective under that is really where we start dealing with equity, and it's to embed equity throughout government operations. The idea behind that is that equity should be seen in every strategic priority. And the way we started doing that is with the first strategy, which is to create infrastructure to elevate and organize equity work within the city and investments in neighborhoods of focus. And we wanted to lead by example by making sure that there were equity champions a part of every strategic team. So as we talk about governmental excellence, there was an equity champion. As we talk about mobility, there was an equity champion, because we wanted to make sure that equity work was highlighted. We understand that in order for us to advance each of these goals, to advance each of these priorities, equity had to be present. So we started with equity statement.
Yes. Sorry. So this equity statement is in draft format. I would like to honor the fact that the addition of Brandon and I worked on this, and it's in draft format both because of today, but we want to also pass it along to the additional equity champions, Patty Caudill, Shara Punsel, Hank Kelly, and Sergeant Dan Adams. There's a lot of wisdom among the group, and we want to make sure that we tap into that. So this is a draft. But for those viewing from home or their computer elsewhere, I will read it so that the community will know as well. So the first starts with a quote. Racial inequities have been baked into government, and that racial inequities across all indicators for success are deep and pervasive. We also know that other groups of people are still marginalized, including based on gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, ability, and age, to name but a few. Focusing on racial equity provides the opportunity to introduce a framework, tools, and resources that can be applied to other areas of marginalization. And that is a quote from the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. The City of Grand Rapids is dedicated to advance equitable outcomes and opportunities by leading with racial equity to address root causes of disparities. The city defines equity as a condition achieved when people have the tools, resources, and connections necessary to fully engage and be prepared to benefit from the opportunities they seek. Racial equity is achieved when one's race or ethnicity does not determine, in a statistical sense, how one experiences opportunity, power, and life outcomes. This targeted approach on racial equity will advance our universal goal of elevating quality of life in Grand Rapids. Equity is one of 6 city values that must be embedded into all of our decisions, policies, and practices. In an effort to dismantle the systemic and institutional injustice that has been prevalent throughout our history in cities across the country, the city has made the conscious choice to highlight equity in each priority area of the strategic plan. The first objective in the strategic plan outlines the city's commitment to creating a structure within the city to lift up racial equity throughout the organization so that each department has the knowledge, skills, and support to intentionally remove and prevent barriers created by systemic and institutional injustice. Additionally, to the extent possible, all strategic plan metrics and corresponding data will be disaggregated by race and ethnicity, and when needed as a proxy, by geography. This statement is an urgent call to action to transform government to achieve positive and sustainable community-level impact. And then we'll give it to Lou.
Yeah.
All right. Good afternoon, Mayor, Commissioners, Mr. City Manager. Do you have questions or comments related to Objective 1 under Governmental Excellence, that objective being embed equity throughout government operations?
I want to first of all thank you for that very comprehensive equity statement, and just suggest that the second strategy reflect the verbiage that was in the statement on the disaggregation of data, and add the phrase when possible, as we've done in the strategy, because it may not always be possible.
So when you say that's impossible?
Oh, when possible, because there may be, we may go to a community meeting and we say 100 people showed up, and you say, well, what was the composition? Well, we didn't take attendance. It was just sign in. It wasn't any identification of who was there. So it may not be possible in that case. Yeah.
I have a question. My question is, when you have the city of Grand Rapids is dedicated to advance the equitable outcomes and opportunities by leading with racial equities to address rooted causes of disparity, how do you measure rooted causes of disparity?
So as you disaggregate outcomes for different communities, whether it be from the GLBTQI community, women, other marginalized groups, if you disaggregate those communities even further into subgroups by race, you will find those communities of color within those groups are actually experience the worst of the worst outcomes. And so if we can have targeted strategies to those that are positioned furthest away from opportunity, furthest away from power, furthest away from having voice, you actually create a system that that lifts up all and helps the universal community, the broader community. So I didn't answer your question. I can tell by your face. So could you ask it again?
Well, I mean, when you talk about, I just want to get to how do you measure the rooted causes of disparities? I mean, how do you measure that? When you say root, you're talking about going deep to listen or hear what are the causes. How do you measure that? You gave a description of disaggregating something, but that's not measuring the rooted cause.
I think we're talking about looking at it, just like you said, on very deep levels. So it takes a lot of work on our side. City's already doing some training and education so that we can begin to understand in general some of those root causes. But when we talk about looking at root causes, I think that speaks to, at least in part, to strategy number 4 that talks about identifying systemic issues that cause disparate outcomes in the justice system and things of that nature. So in order for us to actually do that, we have to go and look and try to figure it out. We don't come in with all the answers. We don't claim to know every cause, but the commitment is to look for the causes and to try to figure out what it is so that we can develop strategies to fight against the injustice.
I think it's good. I just want to know, when you talk about disparities, everybody says a different definition of what a disparity is.
So Commissioner, so we have to first make sure we're aware of the metrics or the symptoms before we start looking at the root causes. So for instance, like on the metrics section, for example, to what Brandon was talking about, like the conviction records for various people and the differences by race and gender, and you see some of the outcomes there. Or we'll get to some of the other areas around housing or mobility. It will vary on the particular issue, but what we tried to make sure is that we at least have an indicator when there's disparities. And then once we see the indicator, then we have to begin looking deeper into what is really causing it, and then what are we really doing to impact that. And then I think the number two, the racial equity toolkit, and I have been real pleased, by the way, in looking at some of the budget proposals. People have been proposing things in the budget that will attempt to address what is known disparities that their departments are focusing on. So I think making sure that we have conscious metrics, and then that we look and see whether or not the needle is moving, and then ask departments based on the issues, what are you doing specifically to promote more equality in those areas.
Okay, I think I can live with that.
I do want to point out, in one of the metrics, we put the first one of the Third Ward Equity Development Fund, and making sure that, at least for the first year, that we are appropriating, managing, and utilizing that. And even before this meeting started, I was intentional that the staff sent out a update. I'm looking at Eric. Did we send it out? Yeah, that we've been working with the Third Ward commissioners on where we are in terms of developing that fund.
That's going to be about $3 million, right?
Jones. Go ahead.
Quick question. I remember when we were talking about the toolkit, the GEAR toolkit, that there was the possibility for each department to do some type of an assessment. I wonder if that could be a strategy or a goal, because I think it was optional when we began the discussion, so that would be a really good goal to make sure that every department, and I don't know at what level, that they would do that assessment. To the matrix about the Third Ward Equitable Development Fund, I wonder if it would be good to see that $750,000 and see the investment that has gone into the other wards kind of all at the same time, so that you're seeing this stark difference in investment, as opposed to just getting the updates on that small fund.
Yeah, I think in terms of looking at our capital programming and other types of outcomes, even in economic development and new startups and permitting activity, I think we've talked about those metrics, and we can embed those in the plan if they're not already there in other areas. I'm looking at Allison, see if it, but this one was specifically for that, but we can have other metrics around other kind of economic activity. That might be in the letter section.
Sure.
Commissioner Jones?
Yep, thank you, Mayor. I really like the statement as is. I think it speaks to a couple of key points. One is the quote, I think, does an excellent job of providing historical context with regards to racial inequities and its presence within government historically. And I also like the fact that we are making it perfectly clear that we are using a lens in our efforts to lead with racial equity, and we're making that perfectly clear from the very beginning. I think this is something that really needs to be touted on a pretty continuous basis, whether it be through public presentations or it's like wherever we go. Whenever we're talking about our city, we need to make it a point to let folks know that this is how we're engaging in the space of equity. And this, I think in particular, what this does is it clearly defines equity through our lens. And I think what I like most about that is if left to, if left for others to guess, it could be all over the place. What we're articulating is this is what we see as a priority, and this is how we're going to go at it. We speak, of course, of targeting universalism, and then lastly, this statement that we are making the conscious choice. And so I think it keeps coming back to this very firm statement that this is what we are being intentional about. And the reality is we have a choice. We don't have to do this. We could essentially kind of go along the lines of business as usual, but we're making the conscious choice that we're going to lead with a lens of racial equity, and that we're going to be conscious of the historical context. It's like, this is what got us here. And so, I'm very pleased with what's been developed thus far.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Yep.
I have a specific question. We're still talking about this section. You want feedback on the entire section?
No.
Well, I think Lou is going to help provide an overview of the remaining objectives.
Yes.
And Stacy and Brandon were really the lead on the first objective for equity.
Okay, so let me then just talk about the first one. For the breakdown in the difference of conviction records and charge records, is there a reason we left off age, juveniles versus adults? Because I'm very concerned about juvenile offenders, young people who are arrested, charged, and I know, years ago we did the juvenile crime index, and I know that hasn't been updated, but I think that there's real opportunity as we look at the data to also aggregate it by age. So did you all talk about that?
Well, I can speak to that. So Gary Secor, the court administrator, was part of this team, and he and I were discussing yesterday other potential metrics, and the one you're mentioning, Mayor, different age cohorts by offense categories was one that we talked about. Another was related to recidivism, comparing, for example, the drug and sobriety court outcomes to more traditional court outcomes. So there are other metrics we're looking at, and we're not convinced these are the best.
Okay, well, the other one I would love for us to consider is to add some data in here around the individuals who participate in restorative justice. I know that's largely young people, but I think there's real opportunity to expand that.
And I just wanted to further state that the Equity Champions talked about the strategy to disaggregate data by demographics, and kind of honed in on race, ethnicity, gender, and geography as those to really push for all data to be disaggregated by, but recognizing that it will take a large amount of resources and time for all city operations to do that where possible, and noting that there are some specific instances where we may call out a different demographic, like age or perhaps ability in some different areas, and so we've attempted to call that out through the plan, and so I hear you saying that this is one where it would be good to add age in as well. But I just wanted to note that you will see in a few other areas, I think we call out age specifically, and we also speak to ability in a couple other areas.
Great.
And that's your root causes.
Yes.
Commissioner?
I think it would be great with, there are two number 3s here, but in the number 3s and the two number 3s and number 4, if we could, well, and maybe you just need to have it kind of at the beginning of this, but talk about the population, the percentage of the population. So you have this broken out by Caucasian versus people of color. Then there's a footnote that talks about Hispanics are with Caucasians. And so it would be great to kind of spell out at the top, what is the city's population by that same split? And then who then would be included in people of color specifically, so that that'll be clear too, who's, what percentage of the population is included there.
Yeah, these charts are the power of disaggregating data, because people of color don't commit 70% of the felonies of our town, right? I mean, that's the data that we have right now, but that's what we want to change in terms of the outcome, so.
I did just want to go back to, I think, Commissioner Lanier, your question about disaggregating investment by ward under Objective 2, which I think Lou may point out, but there is the 7th strategy is to implement an equity scorecard for capital requests, and looking at how could we score capital requests with an equity perspective as well as kind of an environmental perspective. So in that, I envision that breakdown by ward would be included as a part of that.
Okay, great, thank you.
Also, Commissioner Lanier, in response to your initial comment about applying the GARE toolkit to all departments, we can look at language that's closer to what you described, but we were agreeing with that in the the second line of strategy 3 of existing projects and services. And we had quite a bit of conversation about how would you operationalize the GARE toolkit so that you could, you could look at lots of existing services rather than applying them to discrete projects. So we are thinking along the same lines.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, so I do want to be mindful of some time, and that we probably want to keep each section, if we can, to 20, 25 minutes, but equity I know was a really important part of the conversation at our last session, so we definitely wanted to take some time, and I really thank Stacy and Brandon and the other equity champions that are here for the work that you led there. But now I think if we're ready, let's have Lou transition to the other objectives that are included in the governmental excellence.
Right.
I'm left alone.
And I would say let's highlight some of them, and
Right.
we'll hold our questions till he gets through them all. That way we don't get hung up on one.
Sounds great.
So a lot of what I will do is compare what you saw last time to what is before you now, so that you have a sense for what has changed and what's been added. So objective 2, the wording, foster and maintain fiscal sustainability, is as you saw previously. We did remove a strategy, grow the income tax base, from this objective in this priority area, because that seems more a consequence of economic prosperity and affordability and not really a governmental excellence specific strategy. We did add the last 5 strategies since you saw this last. So improve cost effectiveness through continuous improvement and innovation. That's obviously one of our values. Strategically leverage outside funding is important to the sustainability of many projects and programs. And then there are some operation-specific strategies. Evaluate costs of refuse collection programs for customers' waste disposal of city operations. Assess financial savings opportunities at the city's water filtration plant, and create and implement an equity and environmental sustainability scorecard for capital requests, the one Allison mentioned a moment ago. The metrics, I think you'll find that the first 4 are not surprising. They are ones that you would expect to see under fiscal sustainability objective. We did add 5 and 6 in recent weeks, so dollars of external funding received by department, and then the number of gallons difference between max and average summer peak demand and max and average non-summer peak demand. So those are the significant changes to objective 2 since you saw this last. I'll move on to objective 3. There is one change to the wording of the objective. We added the word hire. We thought it's important to not just attract, but also hire high-performing employees. So, so there it is. And we removed what were termed strategies. One was reduce vacancy and turnover rates, which seemed like more of an outcome of strategies. And then we also removed administer an employee satisfaction survey, which seemed more like a task than a strategy. And then the first 2 strategies that you see are new. I won't read each, but I'll summarize them as one is workplace culture focused, and the other is focused on evaluating and implementing employee-friendly policies. Under the metrics, 4 through 6 are new, and they're things that HR is already tracking. And I should note, under metric 6, number of employees annually trained in equity. So many of you are familiar with the real cohorts, so staff and community members being trained in different principles of racial equity. But diversity and inclusion is about to launch regular lunch and learn training opportunities. So to get to that 50% trained obviously requires something that can be done a bit faster than the full-on real cohorts. Questions? If not, I'll move on. Yes?
I just want to point out something that's very, very powerful. So that number 6 is very telling about our aspirational vision for equity, and that we only have 10% of our workforce trained in it. So that is, we have an opportunity to improve on that significantly, and it should start top down with leadership and then management in each department, but we will have to prioritize getting there and then invest in resources to do it. It's going to, instead of just having, you're not going to get there doing lunch and learns. So it has to be some kind of, and it can't, you're not going to get there at lunch and learns, and you're not going to be there for some 4-month program where you have to do a cohort in 8 hours a day. There has to be something that is very effective, but a day long that every employee can experience as an initial exposure to not only that, but other cultural things that we're trying to do. Otherwise, it'll take too long for the impact of culture change to occur.
Can I make one other question about, or one other statement about this this page? In looking at our demographics of our employees and the organization, as we break down the demographics and the diversity of our workforce, are we also going to break it down by department and have goals?
And I think that's already being done.
Okay,
Yeah.
but I mean, is it going to be a part of this because I know we have data all over the city in lots of different places, but I think it's important that it's part of this, like, and I don't know how this is going to be structured and set up, but I do think that there needs to be very specific goals, especially for our departments that lack significant diversity.
And so normally in the strategic plan, you have the overall view of the workforce, and you may break it down by, public safety and non-public safety employees, but for each department, there needs to be another scorecard where they report out, and that could be an equity report that we would measure and monitor and look at those opportunities where there's underrepresentation. But I think if we had 15 different report cards by department in a strategic plan, that would be a little bit much. But there should be another report, though, where we do have that accountability by department.
Okay, all right, thanks. Commissioner, did you have something to add? Okay, all right, go ahead.
Okay, and I should note, maybe this was mentioned previously, but the word new doesn't mean that it's something that the city is just starting to measure. It means that it hasn't been shared publicly yet. So it's new in terms of public visibility. Okay, objective 4 is focused on facilities, and the wording of the objective is unchanged. Ensure we have the appropriate number, location, and type of facilities to meet the demands of government operations, the community, and our growing, changing population. The strategies that have been added are 1, 4, and 5. 1 is focused on a facility workplace analysis to make sure that we have the right types of facilities for different services and operations. 4 is about making all facilities welcoming and accessible. And 5 is about looking at who's coming to facilities, when and for what reason. There may be barriers that are keeping people from facilities, or there may be things that are keeping people from doing things online that are forcing them to facilities. So looking at those kinds of things. And then the metrics, I know facilities has some good metrics. We don't yet have them available here, but they'll be available in a future version of the plan.
I just wanted to reiterate, because I worked with Lou on this team, that we were very thoughtful in strategy 1 about recognizing that we may need some more innovation around the type of workspaces that we have and where they are, right? We don't just need City Hall in the urban core of the city. How are we getting out into neighborhoods? How are we making it easier and more convenient for people who want to be doing transactions and work with the business? And so that's really the clarity around workspace analysis and trying to identify what opportunities do we have to improve in those areas.
I just want to say how much I appreciate this, because I think our workspace matters a great deal to productivity and health and happiness. So I'm happy to see that we're really focused on this. I mean, I have a long list of things that I'd like to see here. They're not all going to happen at once, but healthy is important, accessible for all customers, that we're recognizing the need for, you know, I love number 4. That's really important. And y'all remember when I broke both my feet and I flipped flying into this bathroom up here, and there's no handicap bathroom. I mean, there are things like this that I'm thrilled that we're going to start looking at. Thanks.
Well, and that elevator, you know, craziness when you try to get inside of City Hall. We need a new building to fix that, but we have a very aspirational vision statement.
All right. Objective 5 is technology focused. Again, the wording of the objective hasn't changed from what you last saw. Leverage technology systems to support secure data collection and storage, performance management, decision making, internal communications, and sharing with the community. And we did add strategies 3, 5, and 6. So strategy 3 is to create an IT master plan with all departments included. There are existing IT plans, but we don't think there's something that you would call an IT master plan that currently exists. Develop a smart cities strategy that embeds equity and includes infrastructure, technology, data management, engagement, and communication. And then the last added strategy focuses on identifying procurement barriers, and I think it gets at that idea of how can we be more nimble. The metrics don't have current data listed. That's not to say that there isn't data available. In fact, IT has data available on each of these. But I don't think it's what you would consider to be covering all city operations, because some operations have their own systems that they are managing, not, you know, the IT department isn't managing them for them. And then, of course, some are cloud-based, and so it's kind of complicated in terms of how do you mash all that together to get a metric that's citywide for these. And as you can see, these have not previously been publicly available.
So I have a question about this one, just given the work that we did, for example, with our website and testing it with the community, and how we're going to interface with the community, not just for testing, but for innovation. Because we talked about that. Remember a few years ago, what was it named? What was it? Becky Jo, what's the name of that group in Roslyn?
Code.
Pardon me?
Code for America.
Yeah, Code for America, kind of, yeah, Citizens Lab. If there's an opportunity there, I mean, in reviewing some of that, it was powerful in terms of how we engage citizens because of the changes even in communication and newspapers and so on, and how are we going to get them involved in government in a way that they trust it.
So part of that, the open data sets will be a beginning to doing that. So that's on the 7th metric, the number of data sets we have every year. And there's another metric around open government in terms of that would rank us among other governmental entities about how civically engaged we are. But I do like the idea of more civic collaboration around new ideas. So we'll need to figure out how to measure that.
And we do have some open data sets published now. John, did you say 47? 47, yeah. So we have a foundation to start from, but more collaboration and engagement, yeah.
So I don't really know what 47 means.
Yeah.
Out of 4,700, out of
well, more than that and less than 4,700. So we have an inventory, We have an inventory that would allow us to produce a percentage. I just don't have that.
I think what we're trying to do is incrementally increase it, so we want to do at least 20 sets a year new, and that's kind of low, but that, considering we only have 40 now, and I think the more we automate, we could have an infinite number of data sets, because data is infinite.
Yeah, you have to be careful.
Yeah,
Has to be
right.
manageable.
All right, and then the last objective, number 6, under Governmental Excellence, is the only one here at least, and maybe the only one in the plan that is, it's a project that's also a strategy, or excuse me, also an objective, and it's update the master plan to enable smart growth. It's one that we see touching on pretty much all of the values that are included in the strategic plan. And it's also a significant decision to make in terms of the timing of when that happens. So the metrics you can see include staff, specifically Suzanne Schultz, Planning Director, staff proposed timelines that would see the completion of the master plan update public process phase, so this is metric 2, end of 2022, beginning of 2023.
So that one is something we need feedback on, because I've heard various expectations about when and how soon, and that we might want to revisit having the update. So what I think is on the metrics is scoping out it by 2020 and having the plan completed by 2023, and that would require us to be deliberate about funding for it, and so we're interested in feedback. Is that too soon, too far, about right?
One time, I know I was an advocate for it occurring sooner rather than later. I don't know how my colleagues feel about that, but there's this sense of, for some of the issues around the Housing Now strategies, we were, very intentional about putting them in that bucket and looking to focus on them later, or have them undergo proper vetting by way of the master planning process. So I still am in favor of wanting to do it sooner rather than later.
Okay. And I think we moved all but one that was deferred to the master plan. Suzanne, is that correct? To do sooner. So there's only one of the strategies that are deferred to the master plan. But what if you could come and help us in terms of the feasibility of what it would take to do it sooner? And speak in the mic, since we're on.
Join me.
I think one of the questions is capacity and workload and expectation. So, or maybe that's several questions. One of the big components that we have really focused on recently, especially when we're trying to focus on equity, is preparing the community to plan. So, for example, for South Division, we spent almost a year working with community advisors on devising a plan process that they thought represented the work of, the voice of the community, the priorities of the community, and that would lead us for a successful outcome, making sure those voices were continuously heard. And my aha moment in that was working with those individuals from the neighborhood when we got into a steering committee situation. And we have a couple usual suspects on the steering committee who have traditionally loud voices and are accustomed to power. Because of that interaction with the persons who traditionally have not had power, and kind of listening to them in their original project setup, they were able to feel empowered in the steering committee setting to have their voices heard and to kind of assert themselves in what they thought was right for the neighborhood and not back down. And they have stayed in the process. And that is a traditional issue we have had, I think, as a community, is that you might invite persons that you think should be at the table, and then they don't stay at the table, that they leave for one reason or another? And how do you keep them at the table throughout the entire planning process? So that is one of the reasons that I really urge that we take 9 months to a year in this in a pre-planning phase to prepare those communities that we think are really important to have at the table, and to empower them to feel like it's important that they stay, and to give them reasons to stay as we go through this work. It also depends on your expectations for funding, as far as how much money does the commission expect to invest into the plan versus from other outside sources, because it takes time to write grants, to go through the grant cycles, to leverage those dollars to be able to do that. We have been successful in the past in doing so. When we did the 2002 master plan, there was a partnership with the Fry Foundation in the city of Grand Rapids. They each put in $200,000, and then working with Connie's department, they put in another $160,000 of CDBG monies for community engagement specifically. When we did, we had a longer lead time. We were able to leverage almost $800,000 for the Michigan Street Plan because of federal grant opportunities that were available, and we had some seed money, and we were able to grow it. But it was about a 1.5-year process to collect those dollars, and some of them were from some of the big institutions on the Hill, but it just takes time. So it depends on how much money the commission wishes to put in.
Go ahead, Mayor.
Yeah, I want to be mindful of time here because I think this is a larger conversation. And Commissioner, I think I was with you initially. I felt an urgency. I'm pausing a bit more because I feel like we have a lot of planning processes currently going on that we really need to finish up before we move forward with the master plan. I do think that there potentially is a negative, could be a negative impact as if we move forward with the master plan when we still have a number of plans that we're working on that are kind of smaller, more focused. The other thing I would like to better understand and explore is what does the scope of our next master plan really have to be, knowing that we have a number of area-specific plans that are still very legitimate and valid. We have the Parks Master Plan that has been updated. We have the GR Forward Plan. We have the River for All. And I don't personally have a good sense of the scope that we actually need, and do we have to be as significant and broad as we were the last time, or do we already have some core pieces that just need to overlay, and then we need to identify a few to pull out that we have to focus on? So I feel like we probably need around this body to have a larger conversation, get more information, and better understand all of the other processes that are currently going on and when those will be buttoned up.
I think you make a very valid point, and I will say that I think the original thought behind wanting to start sooner rather than later really had everything to do with making sure that those who had historically been left behind aren't left farther behind. But to your point, with the number of planning processes that we have on the table currently, and the fact that they're happening in neighborhoods or areas that have been historically marginalized, I think it does speak volumes that perhaps we should have a greater focus on completing those. But we should, I think more than anything, just keep our eye on the ball and making sure that as everything develops, that we don't, that we learn from, the mistakes that we've made in the past, and not leave those who've been left behind farther behind.
And the other thing I think we need to have a conversation about, and I know if some of you have talked to me about it, is do we need to do it exactly how we did it last time? What are the options? Right. Who are the partners in the city that that exist today that may have not existed then, that we can utilize? So I think there's a number of things that we need to talk about when it comes to this.
So that's good feedback. So based on what Ms. Schultz has shared in feedback from commissioners, that we should focus on the first metric, 2020, and for the scope, whether or not we need to put more emphasis on that and doing that sooner, and not define the completion date of the larger master plan. But let's begin talking about scope, and then the scope will dictate what the funding should be and the timing and everything else.
Yeah, if I can just add, though, I do, and I agree with all that we're talking about, and know it's a larger discussion. We need more information about options. But what's hanging out there that's huge right now is housing, because we've got to communicate then to the eager community waiting for next steps. So that's another thing we need to consider and how that fits in.
And I think it's a great answer to say it's going to be longer because we want to make sure that the process we're using works for the community. That's a different thing than a money conversation. I mean, those are two different reasons. I can get into that. But I also want to say real quick, smart growth is not, I believe that equitable growth is the smartest growth. But so I wonder if that's, if we want to be consistent, put smart and equitable growth, because in some ways we've grown smartly as a city, but it hasn't resulted in equitable growth. So.
Okay. Well, I think this has been great conversation, but I want to be mindful of time, and thank you, Mr. Canfield and Ms. Schultz. I appreciate that. We are going to now transition. Let's see if we can get through our next section, and then we can take a short break. So we are going to move on now to economic prosperity and affordability. So I'm going to ask Mr. Cloister, Ms. Banchoff, and Mr. Davis to come and join. And actually, Mr. Canfield's going to stay here as he was involved in the first objective as well for this section. Again, going back to having a lot of people work and it being very cross-departmental. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over.
Good afternoon. Is this
good?
on? Am I good?
You're good.
All right, it's hard to tell. So I'm going to stick to the sort of strategy that Lou or Mr. Canfield had. I'm not part of cabinet, so I do not. I'm learning as I go. Had, which is to update you on the changes in this plan from what you saw last time, primarily. So overall, the strategic priority, economic prosperity and affordability. You recall the conversation last time, these objectives are not listed in ranked order from most important to least important. They are all important, but there was a conversation about moving them around. And then also a conversation about whether the objective related to housing belonged here. And that does remain here, largely because being able to afford where you live is critical to being able to prosper economically, or to have economic prosperity. So that does remain here, and then as Ms. Sutter mentioned earlier, there is a fifth objective, which I'll get to as we make our way through this. So objective number one, support a resilient business environment by optimizing city property development and business-related permitting and approval processes and regulations. So that's longer than it used to be, and it's actually a narrower scope. So previously, this objective included strategies related to doing business with the city, so taking advantage of the dollars that the city spends. That's no longer in here. The objective now focuses on making it easy to do business in the city solely. And so those strategies were not lost. The ones that were taken out of here, they are in objective number 2, so we'll get to those in a second. The strategies under objective number 1 focus on efficiencies and continuous improvement and innovation in the city's processes. They promote customer service and collaboration across department, and I think something to note, that's an additional scope of service that the city doesn't offer now is more education and training that's available on these processes and procedures, and then taking advantage of that to bring in other related services from economic development and Office of Diversity and Inclusion and potentially other programming that the city offers that could be beneficial to somebody seeking to do business in the city and liaisoning with the Development Center. Another change I think that is important to note is in strategy number 5, create a small business development ambassador. That was formerly an ombudsman, which when we looked at the definition is kind of indicates of being reactive to problems, which then assumes that there are problems. And we don't want to assume this, so this is intending to be more proactive, play a more proactive role. the metrics in strategy 1, you'll note that they're all new. Again, as Mr. Camfield said, that doesn't mean that they're new data, but that they're being shared publicly for the first time. I think of note, you'll see that metric number 1, the percent of new building and commercial renovations approved administratively, our goal is less than the current state, but there will be a lot of marijuana applications that will not be able to be approved administratively, and so that'll have a downward pressure on that metric. So again, the metrics focus on efficiency and predictability of application processes. They will also, metric 4 and potentially metric number 1, rely on surveying and data gathering and analysis that may need to be enhanced from the current state. And then metric number 5 really measures that new body of work of training and education for the city's residents and people doing business in the city. So I'll stop there and ask for questions on objective 1. I'll go with it. We'll go with
Let me
it.
thank the staff, and I just want to be clear. So that 5th one is not necessarily referring to just solely what was the former or the current BUDS person that we have in development, but this could be, we've talked about the staff having another liaison for small business development and not just a permitting process. So this potentially could be someone who, as we talk about economic opportunities and being more proactive in assisting small business development, not just waiting for a deal to come to the door. So I just wanted to clarify that, and that may mean a new function within somewhere in the city, not necessarily in the development. It's because you already have that service part-time or temporarily, correct? Correct. So there's a need to continue that to make that a stable part of the department, but there's this other need for small business development that's not being addressed by the service.
Very good. We'll move on to objective number 2, which is support the, good job, Mr. Camfield. Objective number 2 is support the creation, retention, and growth of businesses, and there is no change to this, the language in that objective, and it's focused on business success in the city of Grand Rapids. In the strategies under this objective, as I mentioned, there were 2 that were absorbed from objective number 1, which leveraged city spending to contribute to business growth. The strategies focus on utilizing city incentives as well as collaborating with other service providers to achieve business growth and new business startup. There was also a strategy in here that was bumped to a different objective, and that is the one to leverage the river restoration. So that strategy really relates both to businesses and to employment, so individuals. So that is in objective number 3 now. So it remains in the plan, but it was moved down to objective number 3 as it seems like that's where it fits better. The metrics, going down to the metrics in objective number 2. These metrics are really designed to measure how effectively we can promote the utilization of micro-local businesses, as well as the utilization of women and minority-owned businesses. Obviously, there are very fine details in there to be worked out and thought through in the implementation. There's a new effort around something that's been discussed before, and some planning has gone on around, but collaborating with private developers and businesses to achieve greater utilization of micro, local, and women and minority-owned businesses. So not just businesses doing business with the city, but receiving incentives from the city as well. some of the things that are in the metrics that will be continued, that we'll continue to measure is obviously the support of private investment in the city. But we will disaggregate that by industry segments. You'll notice that in metric number 1. And then again, not being repeated with every metric, but disaggregated by geography as well.
So I have a question about this. It goes way back to when I started on the commission, and I remember Kara was involved in this whole economic gardening conversation, and really looking at how we diversify our economy and what amenities are missing in neighborhoods. I don't know if that would be an opportunity for us if we have this proactive approach, but to really kind of get a sense of what's missing, where are people, leakage, where are people going, how can we get them into the city, and what opportunities might we be able to provide if we're really looking at this comprehensively.
Do we want to add the metric? I mean, I heard loud and clear that our MLBE list is not long enough. So do we want to, and for number 5, do we want to track the total number of new vendors, but also the number of new MLBE vendors as a part of that metric, maybe?
And I would add the size of the contract that they
Moving on to objective number 3 then. Increase residents' educational attainment, employment, and wage growth. This one is a slightly changed from what you saw at the end of January, and in that it adds educational attainment as a component of this. So educational attainment is obviously a significant contributing factor to the objective, which is focused on people and residents in Grand Rapids.
So I just had one thought about this one, and that is, you know, 2, 4, and 5 are things that are really much within our control. 1 and 3 are a little less within our control unless we add a statement at the end. So what does it mean to support post-secondary degree attainment? Is that through our advocacy with promise zones, or there needs to be, there's like a ... on the end of 1 and 3 for me that doesn't have something in there that we can actually do beyond just kind of championing it. Whereas 2, 4, and 5, we're going to influence our contractors and vendors. We are going to use our incentives in this way, and we're going to leverage the river. Those are very within our control. So I don't know if something needs to be added to 1.
I think that's a good point, but I do think that this is one where there's incredible opportunity for the city to be much more engaged. And I think we've seen it with some of the work that we've done with GRCC in identifying individuals for skill building that then are teed up to work in city jobs. So I think with some intention, we could have some conversations and be much more active in this space. Not that we would own it or have ownership of it, but I think we could capture ways that we could be more involved.
Yeah, I would even include looking at the trades. We recall the trip we took and the opportunities for community benefit agreements to get and work with the schools, of course, to look at those 4-year apprenticeships with huge benefits that come back to the individuals in terms of decent wages and benefits.
I do think in terms of the economy, if our goal is to have this robust economy, we know that there are a lot of things that happen outside of direct governmental influence. And I heard earlier, or one of our earlier sessions, we were talking about, let's identify what are the things we can lead, what are the things we can support, and what are those things we just get out of the way and just cheer on. And some of the things around educational attainment is sometimes a derivative of the kind of jobs that we are helping to, attract or relocate to the area that would demand additional skill for those jobs that we can begin to, so it's very indirect. It may not be directly related, but I do think if we're going to look at the health of our economy, we got to make sure we're monitoring the various components of economic success.
There is also the work of the Two College Through College studio that supports access to.
That very directly, that's right.
Very directly.
And they have good data that they can share.
Yeah. Okay, so objective 3, we talked about the objective, the strategies briefly, and then I'll go into the metrics. These are a little harder, I think, as kind of the conversation has started here. These are a little harder to get for a Grand Rapids geography, some of these. So in a sense, we're sort of acknowledging that there's no perfect data, but that they're good proxies to a certain extent, and most of them are new. And several of them, if we think about, again, with the directive that the data is to be disaggregated wherever possible, many of these metrics are very closely related to measuring the disparate outcomes in our community. So the employment rate, we have listed in here measuring the employment gap, so the participation in the labor force. And then also measuring the real income growth for prime age workers.
This is just a comment, but I think there's a tendency to think that like poverty is a small group of people in our community, but 49% of our community doesn't meet ALICE threshold, which means they're not able to plan for the future, which means there's no wealth creation. And so that's, this is the power of, and if you disaggregated that 49%, then we'd be looking at some really significant information. So we want people to be thriving, which means they got to get above that ALICE threshold by a significant amount.
Very good. Moving on to objective 4, support housing development and services that help keep people in their home. There's been no change to that language in that objective, and the strategies also remain largely the same, with a note that in strategy number 1, facilitate increased housing supply through the development of a variety of housing types was added. So we talk a lot about housing affordability in the different levels, but this is also talking about housing type then, typology. And then in strategy number 3, that was formerly reduce barriers to housing, but we also added end home ownership, recognizing that home ownership is a wealth creation strategy as well.
So if I might just add, and I know that we've got other objectives, but the home mobility piece that fits in with this so closely, that we think about where we're placing our housing and how it's getting people to work, because that's such a huge component of the cost of affordable living.
So what you're saying, something around TOE districts or housing specifically targeting more housing or density of housing in certain areas?
Yes, and we actually had a conversation with Ryan Kilpatrick about that recently when we were looking at what Ottawa County is doing. So I think I don't know how to phrase it, but further exploration of those, how closely tied that is, because sometimes it's not even the rent, it's the transportation piece that can make up that gap.
Yeah, and I love the metric of the number of net new housing units, but I also want the target for that for each level. So again, you said 3,000, but how many of those are market? How many of those are 100%? How many of those are 80%? How many of those are below? So I think it'd be great to report on the net, but also like how much closer are we to closing the gap?
So a question there, in the metrics, in metric 3 and 4, those are really intended to measure sort of the health of the housing market, right? How tight it is. I think if we were to obtain the data to set those targets, that could replace then these metrics.
But in like metric number 2, when we're talking about by type and by price and affordability level, you know, the percent that's affordable based on the different AMI levels, could we disaggregate the second metric to get to that level of detail?
Could we disaggregate it
Yeah.
right now? We did have a conversation about that. It'd be very hard, I think. We do know a lot about the projects that we support.
Yeah, we do,
financially,
right.
But we don't know a lot about the housing that, you know, we don't have the information on. And so, and then existing housing as well. So yes, we can when we're supporting a project.
Yeah, could we capture like Section 8 housing vouchers, or LIHTC maybe even capture the low-income housing that is available and the increase in those units?
We can track like the.
Can she use
Yeah,
building permit data?
Mr. Canfield,
Pardon me?
can you assist with this?
So we do not currently ask for all construction projects that involve housing for information like what is the price point for rental and that sort of thing. So we do have a project that's kind of on the back burner to gather more of that, but it's not something that we ask for as a matter of course.
But knowing, I mean, as the conversation around affordable housing has been had for the last, long time now, and we really know that the only tools to create most affordable housing is through low-income housing tax credit projects. The majority of the rest of the stuff, unless it's, something some assumptions would have to be made. But if you're building something new and it wasn't supported by a tax credit or supported by a city endeavor that said it was, going to commit to a certain number of units at certain AMI price points, and it kind of, yeah, it's probably assumed to be market rate in some capacity.
And we do have that kind of information.
Yeah, we have information on subsidized units, both project-based and Section 8 vouchers.
That'd be nice to have.
Okay.
Very good. And then wrapping up with objective number 5, this is the new one, support efforts that contribute to making Grand Rapids a destination city. So that did not previously exist. The strategies here, I think you'll pretty quickly note, they're largely around collaboration with existing partners to continue to promote and enhance the city's brand regionally and nationally and internationally, to attract tourists and convention business, and ultimately create a downtown business attraction strategy with partners as well. So similarly, the metrics are mostly external metrics too that we'll report on as in connection with this objective.
Can I? Oh, go ahead.
I was going to add for that fourth metric about occupancy rates. I mean, can that be more citywide, neighborhood-wide? I mean, I think as we look at occupancy rates downtown, I mean, clearly downtowns typically have the highest demand. I think as it towards myself and other places, I try to spend time in neighborhoods because that excites me more than most big city downtowns that all look the same. And so I think that's, and I think that's where we struggle as a community, and we want the redevelopment of our neighborhood business districts, and so tracking occupancy rates in those locations I think is important.
So citywide.
Yeah.
Yeah, commercial occupancy.
Yeah, it could be citywide, or I think probably and maybe I'm wrong, I wonder if the best way to capture that is through the SIDS. I'm sure the SIDS have occupancy rate data.
Just having more refined data than just
downtown.
Yeah, I could not agree more. I think that's a very good point.
I do have a question on the objective number 4. I know you're on number 5. I didn't raise my hand fast enough, but I'm curious if a part of the objective is to keep people in their homes. I'm wondering if there's room to have a matrix or strategy that surrounds how people are losing their homes. So, if it's taxes and evictions, things of that nature, if we could figure out how people are losing their homes, because this is about ownership as well as rental. And then whatever the right matrix or strategy to address that, maybe we can implement that in there.
We could look at that by some of the things that we had spoken about regarding the support services to help people stay in their homes are the eviction prevention program, homelessness prevention, which would be rent assistance in both, and also utility arrearages. And also could look at access modifications and some of the aging in place type things.
Yeah, and even low-income tax forgiveness maybe could be added to that.
Yeah. Because most of those were only for rentals, and the ownership piece is a huge component.
I'm hearing measuring the size of the problem to some degree on evictions, foreclosures, and homelessness. And I think we have other metrics around homelessness, but I think there's probably room we can figure out a way how to quantify that.
Great, thanks.
Can I go back down to 5? And I'm curious out of strategies. So I'm thinking back to the destination asset study that was done. And if I remember correctly, I thought that they highlighted the need to connect trails. That trails tend to be, have a huge impact on visitors and how long people stay. And I know we've talked for a long time about making sure that we connect the trail from the lakeshore all the way north, and that we have some spaces in the city where there's a gap in trail connectivity. And so I wonder if we could add that.
Like, it's actually under health and environment. Close gaps in the regional trail system. So that's a nice one. I think that ties in different areas.
Tie in. Well, I just wondered, because this says maintain and enhance quality accessible public spaces, which I'm assuming is a lot of that is park space and space. I guess that one is, it just seems very broad to me. Maintain and enhance quality accessible public spaces. And I wonder if we should be more specific about what we're actually trying to accomplish. Is it the trail connectivity, which we know is related to visitor experience? Is it the parks and green space, or
Parks, I believe, are covered.
Or Rose Park Circle? Or,
yeah. Parks are covered elsewhere in the plan, so our focus was more on those public event spaces like Calder Plaza and Rosa Park Circle and so on.
Okay.
But I think what I'm hearing is be more specific here so that we can be clear about what it is that we're addressing, and then when we get to health and environment, maybe we could reflect back and know that we have some conversation there about green spaces as well as closing the gaps in the regional trail system.
Great, thanks.
Okay.
So for objective number 5, I think this goal is really good in terms of attracting people to downtown, but I do think we should look at ways of pushing people who come to the city of Grand Rapids into the business district or into the neighborhoods. And so if we can look at a strategy that would do that, it'd be great.
You know, that's a great point, and I don't know the full scope of what a business ambassador would do, but I think there's a lot of opportunity to do that. You know, to do concierge tours in all of the business districts, and to make sure that information about the business districts are provided to all of our hotels, and I think I just think that's an incredible opportunity,
Scott,
especially with there not being very many retail businesses downtown.
Right.
Yeah.
Scott Atcherson would be probably willing to sit down with you and
I'll let you
strategize some suggestions.
Well, I'm also thinking along those lines, even tying in mobility, right? How do we have accessible mobility options that you can tie then to get people from downtown to neighborhoods? Okay.
I was going to say scooters and Airbnb are a great way to get people in neighborhoods.
Scooters and
Okay, well, it's just after 3:15, so we have an hour remaining, and I think this is a good time just to take a quick break. So if everybody by this clock could try to be back in what's going to be 8 minutes or so that we can get started at 3:25, and we'll move on. And I believe our next section is going to be mobility. So thank you.
switch it up a little bit, everyone. We're going to jump to safety because Commissioner Jones has to leave us a little bit early. So if you want to move to the section on safety, which is what number again?
It's on page 21.
Page 21. That would be lovely. Yep, here comes Ruth. All right, and Commissioner Jones. Oh, good. Good, good. Here, I'm going to pass these around. Don't. All right, I'll just take one. All right, that's some lovely chocolate. Chocolate. All right. We need Lanier and Moody and Commissioner Jones. Here it comes. All right. Santi, do they both? Commissioner Moody? All right. No, I thought that was it.
Okay.
Should we just jump in? Let's get started.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. So I'm joined today, my name is Eric DeLine, I'm Deputy City Manager. We'll be talking about public safety or safe community, which is probably one of the most reworked strategies that we've had in this whole discussion today. So I'm joined today by Brandon Davis from Labor Relations, Captain Jeff Collard, and Assistant Chief Brad Brown, and if we need him, Luke Canfield sitting over there, so bring him up if we have to. So, so we had this team worked hard because if you might recall, the bones of safe community in the earlier version was very skinny. You know, it had 3 objectives and not too many strategies. And so since then, this team has had, I think, 9 or 10 meetings. They've worked through about 6 drafts, and they've come up with the priorities that you see in front of you today. And so I'd like to remind you first, what does safe community mean? And the outcome statement is all people feel safe and are safe at all times throughout our community. And then the objectives, and what I would like you to do is, if you're referring to anything, refer to page 21 in the draft you have, because looking back to January earlier this time really is probably not productive since all the changes that have been made. So in objective 1, which was develop knowledge and skills across city departments to better prepare for emergencies with a particular focus on our ability to deliver safety services to vulnerable and historically marginalized areas of the community. Under this, we have 6 strategies, and I'd like to highlight a few of those. The first one is to, number 1, create plans and communication strategies for all major risks within the city. And I think we've seen the importance of being prepared with the polar vortex, the ice storm, and then the high winds that we just have experienced. And then the value of being ready to respond should be in the forefront of our minds right now. The other one that I'd like to highlight is number 3, pursue data-driven and evidence-based strategies to address the root causes of police and fire-related emergencies. And the cure violence assessment might be one example of that. And so this is where we can innovate and not imitate and do things that are novel and productive in our community. And then finally, the last one I'll highlight as a strategy is number 6, equip police officers with tools and support to help during mental health crises. And this is one that has become more evident as one that we should focus on this year and work on. So the metrics are arranged around being trained to respond to emergencies, so the NIMS training system is very good and is what we have based our response protocols on, and it works for us very well. And we just need to make sure that all the persons who have responsibilities in the program are well-trained.
Eric, can I, or
Sure.
Mr. Dolan, can I ask a question? Number 4, the cross-reference code compliance data with fire and police department, what is the value in that, and what are we trying to accomplish?
Well, I'll start and I'll let our team members jump in, but I think the idea is that it's almost like they're, like in your profession, they're co-occurring disorders. And I think what we'll see in this is that there are co-occurring things, attributes of a property or that may lead us to have an idea why things are happening at place. But Captain Keller?
Essentially, I think what we were trying to accomplish there was closing any gaps that may occur. There's things where code compliance by themselves may go out there and find some things, no smoke detectors, and how is the fire department becoming aware of that? Just like we may go out and find a hoarding type situation that would impact fire and code compliance, and being able to make sure that everybody's on the same page and is aware of any potential concerns that would have public safety implications if we didn't coordinate effectively amongst the 3 groups.
Nice, thanks, Captain. And so then I wonder, how can we capture that impact in a metric?
Go ahead. From our standpoint, there's, at least in this area, in terms of safe communities, there were several strategies that are, in fact, their own metrics, so to speak, and the idea there would just be the communication between the 3, making sure that we're, we're not missing anything, or those gaps are closing, and making sure that we're doing that internally between the departments.
All right, thanks.
Anything to add? Okay. So I'd like to move on then to objective 2, which is to create a shared understanding with the community about what constitutes timely, equitable, and effective safety outcomes, and align performance expectations and resource investments accordingly. And this has to do with the values of accountability, collaboration, and innovation. And I'd like to highlight strategy 2, which is increase police critical performance metrics when responding to emergency incidents. And really, this is similar to what the fire department does in terms of measuring how often the reliability, concentration, and distribution, how often they meet their metrics. It would be having similar metrics for the police department. And it's, I think, a good indication of our ability to respond. Number 4 is one I'd like to highlight, which is develop the ability to effectively communicate, staff, manage, and respond to man-made risks, which could be marijuana, opioids, mental health, active violence, micro-mobility, autonomous vehicles, and reactivation of the Grand River. So being able to understand the risk profile of what we're faced with and deal with it effectively. And then number 6, develop data-driven, actionable, and comprehensive Vision Zero transportation safety plan with meaningful input from the community, and begin implementation when the plan is complete. And so this would be taking the Vision Zero resolution that we've adopted and the work that we've been doing and getting measurable outcomes from it. So you can see the metrics there. We've added 4, 5, and 6, which are things that we have data on but have not reported publicly before. Okay. So I'd like to move on now to number 3. And
just one correction. I know that a lot of risks are attributed to men, so I would, but I want to be equal in sharing of risk, and so I would suggest we change the term from man-made risk to human.
Or human originated?
Human created. No, it's human created.
We did it. Good catch. Okay. So now moving on to number 3. which is to enhance our partnerships with the community, within the community, to recover from significant incidents that occur in our city. So in the last event, we stood up shelters, and that's part of that type of response. Strategy number one talks about having fully functional neighborhood recovery centers within a reasonable distance of the impacted area within 24 hours of an extended major emergency. So that could be having and Brad, maybe you, Deputy Chief or Assistant Chief Brown, perhaps you could describe what you mean by that.
Sure. So an example would be, in the last few years, we've had isolated incidents based on geography. The wind shears along the south part of town. It doesn't do much good to establish emergency centers or resources here at City Hall when we have people in the far south end of town that need assistance. So our idea is for geographical type emergencies to establish centers in a reasonable distance where the emergency is taking place, so kind of a field ops, and people can get assistance much closer and easier than coming all the way to City Hall.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Okay, good. So let's move on to objective 4. So, which is to provide professional community-oriented policing services to enhance trust and ensure the legitimacy of the police department and the safety of every resident, business, and visitor. And I would say, and I'll let the team talk about this a little bit, this is the one that the team spent a considerable amount of time on and was, even up till the last minute, right up to the deadline, was working on refining this strategy because it's really critical. So in this area, strategy number 1, complete the police staffing and deployment study to develop an adequate and consistent staffing model throughout the entire community. That's one that I think is self-explanatory, but important. We'd like to highlight one that is labeled number 2, which is utilize findings from the annual review process to identify gaps in current administrative or operational subjects in order to develop training curriculum that increases performance and improves the safety of the community and police personnel. And then the team has provided some ideas of what that training could include. So it's, to identify things that occur and then train to those occurrences in a way that helps to improve performance in the future.
Is the CALIA evaluations, is that actually number 2 or? Yeah. Okay, so this is just, okay.
Just a typo.
Got you. But it's a separate item.
Yes.
In and of itself, okay.
Yep. And then number 7 is evaluate and design innovative policing models that equitably protect and serve residents while creating a path to healthy relationships between police and community. And so these might be evidence-based approaches or different tactics, techniques, and approaches for community policing or other ideas along those lines. Then I'll let the team talk a little bit about that.
When we talk about number 7, I think it speaks directly to what we've been hearing from both commission and community as it relates to what is really needed from police. Oftentimes we hear a conversation that says we want police to police better. And then we get national statistics to say our police department is better than all these other police departments. And those things seem to compete with each other. So we went back to really sit down and think about what is it that we're asking police to do. And what we're really asking police to do is look at ways to police differently. Because if we look at what's already going on, they're ranked highly. They're getting great reviews on a national level, but the community is still saying, we don't like what we're seeing. There are things here that we would like to be done differently. So this commitment says what we'll do is evaluate and maybe even be innovative and design new ways to police. And that's where that innovation piece really comes in, because when we look at models that currently exist, they don't really get to the heart of what we hear communities saying. So that's a major investment from the city. That's a major investment from the department. But it's saying we have to do something different. And in order to do that, we really need to evaluate and maybe be forerunners and design a new way to do this work.
Good.
Yeah. Can I ask some questions about metrics? Were you going to talk about metrics at all?
They are here, and I'd be happy to take your questions, yes.
Okay. So for the index crimes, can you remind me, I can't remember, is UCR data broken down by any type of demographics? Do you know?
I don't think that anything we've ever distributed is broken down that way.
Okay.
In terms of what we have happening here in the city of Grand Rapids.
Just would be interesting, throughout the rest of the plan, we break down information by demographics, and it seems like it, going back up to some of our goals, having it broken down by demographics, I think would be really helpful to see if there's changes or, again, I don't know the availability and how easy it would be to pull that, but I wonder if we could add that. And then, a lot of the metrics are outputs, which I think are good to capture, but I'm curious if we can think about what are some things that we could do to really capture if we are moving the needle and making progress when it comes to building trust.
Yeah. So one of the things we talked about during the police department budget review was the Elucid tool that we have.
I was wondering that.
That measures trust on an ongoing basis.
And neighborhood specific.
Yep, and we could add that here very easily to monitor that and have that be part of what we do. And that's actually a KPI that was recommended by the police department. A key performance indicator that was recommended by the police department.
I'm sorry. Your service areas, don't they represent demographics?
They represent geography.
Yeah.
So as we talk about all of these metrics, part of the overall equity metric is that all of them will be disaggregated by race and gender identity, and geography. So although it's not listed next to each metric, the thought is that each of these metrics is to be disaggregated that way. And as we speak to Mayor, your point, you talked about being able to capture some of those feelings of trust. And under the Engaged and Connected Community area, we talk about the community surveys that will be done, and those community surveys will be one way that we could look at gauging some of that.
All right. Commissioners, questions, comments on this section, Commissioner?
Well, back to the data that will show Grand Rapids demographics. I think we, at least, and I haven't been on the Public Safety Committee for a while, but I know that we didn't have that before, and I don't know what it is yet, what we may want to study. I mean, we had a traffic study at one point. You've provided some data at the very beginning of this on felonies and misdemeanors and so on. So I don't know how to capture this as well, but the Public Safety Committee might, for example, ask for data on something if there is an issue that comes up. So I can imagine that might happen from time to time, and that the police department might want to gather some data. So I don't know how we add that, but I think we ought to be able to be nimble in asking those questions and providing the data when there's an issue or a problem, or whether there's a solution out there that we want to pursue.
Well, there's a couple of things. What I'm hearing, there are some metrics that are lagging indicators that, we measure what happened after something is done, and there's others that are leading that, we use as preventive, for like preventive policing, like the number of people trained in something in order to improve a service or the coverage of a certain area. But on the back end, after something has happened, particularly like requests for data, there's one that we have, there are a couple I'd like them to clarify, related specifically to information and transparency and openness. It kind of goes back to one of the conversations we talked about earlier with data sets, open data. So right now, one of the 40 should be the policies and procedures that the police department has as an open data set. But another metric we talked about was responsiveness when we do get requests. And I'm going to ask Brandon if you can explain number 5 to that and why that's important, and also if you could elaborate on 6 and 7 as well.
Sure. So when we look at the metric in number 5, we're talking about the percentage of Foia requests that are denied by the city and then overturned by the court. What that means is that, as you all know, that we get Foia requests all the time for specific information. In this instance, we're talking about specific to police, questions regarding things that went on with the police department or cases or things of that nature. and we have individuals that have to review that information and then respond and either release it or deny that request. If the city denies that in error, or a court decides that it should have been released, then the court will overturn our decision in order that we release that data. So the numbers we'll be looking at is the number of FOIA requests that are actually denied by the city as compared to the number that the court tells us that we have to release, and that'll show how transparent we're really being with the information based on the confounds of law. When we look at number 6, which is something new, we'll be looking at the percent of civilian appeal board findings that differ from the internal affair investigation findings on a statistical level. So as you all know, the internal affairs division is the division that looks at police officer complaints that come in, or discipline or things of that nature that come in, and internal affairs makes a decision regarding it. The civilian appeal board is the body that then looks at some of those things, or where citizens can appeal to and say, hey, I disagree with the internal affairs findings. So what we want to track is the number. We want to look at the number of cases where the civilian appeal board is saying, internal affairs, you got this wrong. And if they're saying that, we can see the number and see what type of variance that is to see how well our internal affairs division is doing. And we look at number 7, we're looking at the number of unreasonable use of force and unbiased policing complaints submitted to internal affairs, and that's disaggregated by finding. So the internal affairs division reviews cases of use of force where police officers have used force for one reason or another, and a finding is determined as to whether or not that officer did something properly or improperly, and they either substantiate or exonerate the officer, or there's other ways of labeling it, but they substantiate or exonerate the officer based on policy and law and a review of that particular incident. And the same thing is true for the unbiased policing complaints, what's most commonly called like driving while black complaints or something like that. So we'll disaggregate those results by finding, and then we'll be able to see the numbers, the number of cases that are actually substantiated and the number of cases where officers are exonerated.
And Captain Callard, is this metrics that are comparable by clear standards to other departments, so we can see how we fare compared to other jurisdictions across the country in some of our metrics?
I assume there's got to be ways. That information is put out by the majority of departments, and this is nothing new that we haven't been doing for some time. It's got some additional specific focus associated with it, with those 2 particular types of complaints, but we've always given out our finding, or the statistical data of the findings of internal affairs.
I think what my observation has been, I think when we talk about safety in our community, it's pretty relative to just our experience in our community, and it would help in some cases where we see how we compare to other similar size community. And we know crime rate is something that we look across the areas, but there are other things that we can do just to have a relative view of how safe we are compared to other areas. Now, at the end of the day, it only matters what our residents think, because they want to be safe in this community at all times. But I think it helps to create some context around some of our conversations.
Yes.
Yeah, I actually have a question, because as I'm looking at the outcome, all people feel safe and are safe at all times throughout our community. Is the Lucid survey asking that type of a question, or is IA, when they're doing their review from complaints, asking that type of a question, or any of the other matrix that we have here, are we asking a question about how safe did you feel? You know, when people are requesting smoke detectors in their homes, are we asking that question specifically? And if we're not, is there any conversation being had about how do we make sure this question is being asked so that we can know that we're accomplishing the goal?
All I can really speak to is, as far as the Elucid survey goes, is it's measuring 3 different components. 1 is trust. How much do you trust the police department? 2 is satisfaction. How satisfied are you with what the police department is providing in terms of services and response and customer service standpoints, and then the trust, and then safety component. How safe do you feel within your community?
Okay.
And each month, it goes month to month. Each month, we're getting scores. Each month, those scores are broken down by service area as well as to a beat level. Some of this is still a work in progress. It started out as being kind of scored more like a credit score. It's recently transitioned into a kind of a 1 out of 100 type of a score. But this is a third-party vendor that's currently measuring those 3 areas on a monthly basis and providing us with the information and also some of the questions that were specifically being asked if you haven't taken the survey online already.
I'm so good. I'd like to also add to what Mr. Davis said earlier, is that we will have a organizational engagement around all of our major services to citizens, and that is a tool that mid and large size communities use, the American Community Survey, in terms of how cities fare. And there are specific questions around safety, similar to the elucid question, and we can design that survey, work with the vendor to measure other qualitative things that we want to find out about surveys and about how our citizens feel as they sample a group of residents.
Yeah, I'm getting better clarification in my mind about what I was after in terms of the other data. And maybe Captain Collard, you can respond to this. I'm thinking about measuring even solutions, like for example, for a while we didn't adopt it, but we were thinking about ShotSpotter. So let's say this Public Safety Committee says, let's take a look at this, let's implement it, and let's test it. So something like that. And of course we had, the 12-point plan that was brought to us by the community. So whether it's community or police or both together, capturing that kind of data as well, which I think would be extremely useful, but whether you want to invest in something like, for example, ShotSpotter over the long term. Does that make sense that we would, or would you automatically be capturing that? Do we need to list it?
To the best of my knowledge, anytime we're going to implement anything in terms of programmatically, we're going to assess how that's performing. When we talked about ShotSpotter as an example, there would have been a before and then an ongoing assessment of how that particular item was implemented, and then a continual evaluation in terms of what adjustments need to be made in terms of our response to whatever it is that we're doing. So some of that is, once we go in that direction, figuring out what exactly the program is, whatever it is, I would be kind of speculating beyond that in terms of without knowing what specific item you're looking at, but we would be figuring out what metrics for anything like that and assessing it.
I think given new technologies, whether it's ShotSpotter or the cameras that we are encouraging our private sector to use, all that sort of thing that's kind of emerging, that there will be opportunities to look at it, see, and measure it and test impact.
And that's a good point that I don't think I brought up earlier in the framing. We've talked about the plan being one that evolves over time and is updated as we go. And to the extent through innovative practices, we identify something new that we feel should be tracked and reported and a metric associated with it for purposes of the plan, then we can add it and come back and elevate that and bring that here. So hopefully that's a way that we can identify those new areas and maybe some new metrics in the future that could definitely be included in the plan.
Okay, thanks.
I want to be mindful of time, but Eric, Mr. DeLong, I don't think we talked about Objective 5. So
We have not yet, and I was on my way there. Thank you. So Objective 5 has to do with this, which is support efforts to ensure all residents have safe, stable, and permanent housing. So here, this has to do with homelessness and chronic homelessness. And so for example, strategy 3, support programs that reduce the need for emergency services by persons experiencing chronic homelessness, which is something that we talked a little bit about earlier today. And number 4, support, leverage, and promote home repair and home safety services to improve maintenance of existing housing supply. So those are a couple strategies for ensuring that residents have safe, stable, and permanent housing. And then there are metrics associated with those as well. Very good.
That's pretty straightforward.
I'd like to thank our distinguished team here, Mr. Brandon Davis, Captain Jeff Collard, and Assistant Chief Brad Brown. Thank you very much, and thank your team for all their hard work.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to invite Mr. Josh Naramore to head up, and I see that we have just about 20 minutes left, and so we'd like to review the mobility section and then just spend a couple of minutes wrapping up and thinking about our next steps. And Josh, I think mobility, or excuse me, Mr. Naramore, thank you,
Yes.
page 18.
Page 18. Good afternoon, Mayor and Commissioners. So I'll be as quick as I can just to entertain whatever questions and comments you do have. A couple things I wanted to point out is the outcome statement did change. We expanded upon it basically to reflect a lot of the feedback that you had had. Since we had dropped for all, we wanted to capture affordability and equitable outcomes within the actual statement for the outcome. So as it now reads, innovative, efficient, and equitable mobility solutions are safe, affordable, and convenient to the community. So that was a change. And then I also wanted to highlight that really objectives 2 and 3 remain unchanged from the January 22nd. But what we did is we modified objective 1 and added at the end, reduce single occupant vehicle travel, which formerly was a strategy, but it seemed more like something that should be in the objective statement because that's reflected in a lot of the work like Vital Streets, the GR Forward planning process. And then objective 4 was reworded to really focus on the importance of operating and maintaining the city's transportation network and then collaborating and working with partners to connect to the regional transportation network. And some of that was to reflect some of the language about how are we collaborating and how are we working with the community. So those are the 2 big changes, and then I'll just quickly kind of go through. For objective 1, we focused on breaking 3 sort of modal areas, which is to improve the ridership on and exploring the expansion of the fare-free transit network, which currently is the Dash and the Route 19, and then also and with the Rapid. The second one is increasing biking by increasing the bicycle network and ensuring facilities are maintained.
Yeah, Josh, can I?
Yes, sure.
Mr. Naramore, can I make a comment on that?
Sure.
So and this is, I don't mean to get into the weeds too much, but number 2, I wondered why it was increase biking by increasing bicycle network. My opinion is that we need to improve the bicycle network, and there are some areas we really don't need to increase it. It just needs to be better connected, more thoughtfully laid out, and so I don't necessarily think increasing it is where we always need to go. And then I wondered why improve ridership, it says improve instead of increase. Is our ultimate goal to increase the number of people utilizing the service?
Yes, but it's also to improve the experience.
Okay.
So it's trying to balance both with one word. Is not only we're measuring in the metric the number of use, how many people are using it.
That's okay. Good. Thanks.
Strategy 3 is to increase walkability by increasing the sidewalk networks and ensuring that the facilities are maintained. One thing that we had really increased a focus on is strategy number 4, which is to create employment-related transportation solutions. And this is to get at one of the challenges that we talked about is for particularly the neighborhoods in focus, it's access, there are jobs, but getting people from the neighborhoods of focus to the jobs is actually the current challenge. And right now, 49507 is the largest subscriber to the Wheels to Work program that Hope Network operates. And then actually this came up during the economic prosperity and affordability conversation. Under strategy number 5 is to really focus on reducing the household transportation costs and eliminating cost barriers to accessing mobility. So when we're looking at that as, if transit is an option, if you can't afford to actually ride the bus, and then also looking at that with, car ownership and other things, it's not affordable.
For item number 3 about the maintenance of the sidewalks, does that also include the concept of potentially plowing sidewalks and not just maintaining the concrete infrastructure that's there, but making them usable in a more year-round basis?
Yes, and then if you look under the metrics, we've actually added a new metric under number 3, which is one of those items that City Manager Washington has brought up, is about a pilot program around looking on how to do snow plow maintenance on sidewalks, particularly in partnership with GRPS and the Rapid, around how we look around schools and bus stops.
It says number of miles plowed. We may have to start with the number of feet.
Yes. Yes. But under the metrics, we're focused on mode share and tracking that across all of those different modal categories. We're trying to focus on the percent of the population that lives within 15-minute or better public transportation service, as mentioned about sidewalks plowed. Also looking at the vital streets metric, which is how we're improving the sidewalk network overall. A metric of average number of minutes traveling to work, which showing that across different modal categories and how long it really takes to get there. And then you'll notice throughout the entirety mobility one, there's a qualitative metric about adding on to the survey to really talk about the perceptions about that, because that's really an important piece. The data tells you one piece, but as we know, particularly around objective 3 with parking, there can be different public perceptions of it versus what the data is actually telling us. For objective 2, pursuing innovative and 21st century mobility solutions, one of the focal points that we were trying to make around this whole area is we need to continue to be innovative and looking towards adding innovative solutions, but we need to make sure that they're working for everyone throughout the entire community and that they are equally accessible across the whole city. So you'll see that carried through, and we're piloting new mobility programs such as car share, bike share, e-scooter, and universal dispatch application, which you may wonder what that is. That's a nicer way of saying mobility as a service, or one unified application that you could pay for services, access Lyft, and that's something that we're doing currently with the Ford City of Tomorrow Challenge with Kaizen Health. Then there's developing a regional mobility and transportation demand management program with public and private partners. Pilot autonomous and connected vehicle services. Again, making sure that the pilot that we're currently working on is downtown, but how do we replicate that across the city? And then strategy number 4 is complete a shared micromobility plan. So beyond just piloting things like bike share and e-scooters, how do we maintain them and how do they work for everyone beyond the pilot phase? So there's a lot that's going to be learned, but how do we end up carrying that forward? And then the last one is to continue to look at our fleet, the city fleet that we have, and being innovative on how we can make it more active and also electrified and more sustainable moving forward. And the metrics all under this are also related to trying to track who's using it and where is it being used, whether that's an electric vehicle charging station, any of the pilot projects we have out there, and then also getting feedback from stakeholders of the awareness of the different options that are available to them. Objective 3, develop an effective customer responsive parking system. This remains relatively unchanged. The one thing I would point out is we have kind of rolled the former strategy of develop more commuter parking into focusing on developing a parking master plan to guide future investments. That's telling us how much, where do you need it, and when do you need it? And that's both for the on and off street. And that's a component of the departmental strategic plan we're working on with Economic Development Services. And then continuing to educate and inform the public on parking options and the new technology. So as we put new technology out there, how can we help people figure out how to use it and make it more customer friendly? Item number 1, or strategy number 1 remains unchanged because there was a lot of, I believe, feedback around the table that that's something that we need to continue to do. If we're building new parking, we need to make sure it can be repurposed or reutilized for future investments. And the last is making sure that when we're implementing new parking technology that it has as many payment options as possible, whether that's allowing for debit, credit for those who are unbanked populations, but making sure that we're really trying to carry that forward. For the metrics, we tried to keep this really simple. It's just in the demand for the services that we have for parking. What's the capacity for the on and off street system, both downtown and all of our neighborhood business districts for parking? And the last one is objective 4, which is to focus on, as I read it earlier, operating and maintaining the city's transportation network and working with partners to connect to the regional transportation network. The first strategy is how are we coordinating our investments with organizations like the Grand Valley Metro Council, Michigan Department of Transportation. The second one is really critical for how we're developing, operating, and maintaining our transportation infrastructure and taking care of it. The third is performing a critical needs assessment of freight and goods infrastructure. This is one that came up just recently where Mr. DeLong and I met with Gordon Food Service on Friday to talk about food delivery on loading zones throughout the city. So that's a really important piece. And then the last one is just the importance of completing the Equitable Economic Development and Mobility Strategic Plan. And the metrics are focused on reporting out what we are regularly doing with the PACER, the pavement surface evaluation and rating indices for street and road conditions. And then also focusing on how our signal system is in a state of good repair And then the last is the dollars invested in all of those different types of infrastructure investments. And again, as mentioned, across all of these, that would be disaggregated by all the different metrics that had been previously referenced.
All right, Commissioner?
One thing that wasn't referenced on here, Josh, was pedestrian kind of mobility as it relates to, with our Vision Zero stuff and interaction between pedestrians and other modes of transportation as it relates to safety. And
so one thing that we did do is tried to focus that a lot more in the safe communities conversation. Okay. And I think as part of that, I should have probably referenced that, is transportation safety. We had a lot of conversation around all the city teams about how it's important to, it's very critically important to mobility, but there are a whole bunch of different elements of that in the safe communities piece, which is looking at pedestrian crossings, the bikeability, and carrying on a lot of the work that's been done through the Vision Zero pieces. So.
And there, just Commissioner O'Connor, there is one that says it's under Objective 2 under Safe Community, number 6, and that one speaks specifically to the Vision Zero Transportation Safety Plan.
Commissioners, other questions, comments?
I do have just a couple of comments to add. Number one, thank you, very, very thorough, efficient, covering it. On the parking availability on Objective 3, on the parking system, similar to what we were discussing in housing in terms of the need or the demand. One of the things that last night in the Mayor's State of the City address, she got almost a standing ovation when she talked about increasing parking availability and parking by 2,500 spaces in downtown. So just like we know the housing gap, the supply gap, and I know you have the percentage of permits, and is there another number we can have that kind of, I guess once we get our strategic parking plan, our mobility plan, we can have specific quantifiable goals that we can measure towards, both long-term or 5 years or every year, or something of that nature, whether or not we know we're moving the needle.
Last summer, we completed an inventory of every parking space in the entirety of the city of Grand Rapids. We actually have an inventory right now by price. What we don't have is real-time availability. So metric number 1 speaks to the city assets, because we know that we have better real-time data for that. So in terms of tracking like construction and the overall amount of spaces that are added or deleted or changed or transitioned, we are actually working with Downtown Grand Rapids Incorporated to actually be able to do that as part of development. So when a permitted development moves forward to construction, and then that comes online, and that would be an interactive map that we would update regularly. And then as part of the parking master plan, we would figure out ways in which we could better develop metrics around that. But currently, we only know that for the city assets for the on and off street system.
Well, and I think that's it. But in the future, you think that we'll be able to capture the privately held spaces as well, because that will likely be the future, is more privately owned.
Yes. It's almost all private.
Almost all private.
Some
now
will be city.
We're leasing.
Yes.
The city will be leasing hundreds of those spaces for monthly parking, but it's largely the private sector, which you probably remember when the state changed the brownfield, some of the rules related to brownfield and made parking an eligible expense. When you run the numbers, it makes a whole lot of sense for private developers to build the parking. All right.
Okay.
Thank
you, Mr. Nairmore.
4.5 minutes to spare.
So I think in wrapping up, just recognizing, as we stated, that we are going to be looking to use the special briefing time allocated next Tuesday, March 5th.
Yeah.
I believe that's next Tuesday, yes.
It is.
From about 11 to 12:30, that we will continue this conversation, and the topics that we will still be addressing will be the health and environment section, engaged and connected community, and then following up on our conversation about equity. So I think with that time, I feel pretty confident that we'll be able to get through the remainder of the plan and an overview and allow for questions. So with that, I just want to ask, are there any final questions with respect to the process or where things stand before we finish up for today?
My only question is, and I should remember this because I think we talked about it at the last meeting, but are both the March 5th and 26th meetings, have they already been posted as public meetings?
The March 5th meeting, yes.
Okay.
At this point in time, I don't think we've had a discussion for March 26th, but the thought was that it could happen during a regularly scheduled commission meeting, I think is our thought at this time. But I also wanted to give Mr. Patton and City Manager Washington the opportunity to make any comments.
Thank you. So I think today my silence has spoken volumes, frankly. You've come a long way from all the sticky notes on the wall and developed a plan that had been guided and credited basically to the leadership of commissioners here, but also initially when Ms. Sutter introduced all of the people within the city, your employees who helped put things together. I thought it was a pretty big demonstration of how embedded the plan is already becoming within the organization. Your next steps are going to be to continue with that, share it with the community and others, and also there's going to be an accountability part of it, where you've got the plan and there'll be reports that come out, but the basic conversations that you have are going to be around the mission and values, and you'll ask questions about, hey, look, there's this new thing coming. How does it support the plan? How are we using it, taking the equity lens from it and all the other different values you have? So you've come a long way. Tip my hat to you for it.
Thank you. City Manager?
Yes, thank you, and I want to thank commissioners for, again, your time. I know this is a significant amount of time to commit to something like this, but I think it's well worth it. It gives us valuable feedback, and it's good for the staff to hear your thinking out loud on these issues. I want to thank the staff again for all of the collective work that has gone into getting us to this point, and we're almost there. We're almost there. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. All right. So, Commissioners, we are adjourned, and we'll be back in here at 7 p.m.
Can I just make one request?
Oh, yes. Yes.
It would be helpful if there was a way to add the presenters' names to the sections that they're presenting. I find myself writing that, and then if you could have the handouts hole punched so that they can go into the binders that were provided.
You can do that.
Thank you. Feedback.